Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how I painted my Games Workshop Sloppity Bilepiper. Now first off, let me apologize for the video quality. I know I'm off screen a lot or it's not very clear, but I hope we can make it through this together. I'm going to focus less on techniques in this video, and I just want to show you more how to get some cool, quick skin tones if you're painting a Nurgle army and don't have a ton of time to spend, but you still want it to pop on the table. I'll be loosely following the box art for this tutorial, but you'll see I made a couple small tweaks here and there or changed my mind. Let's get to it. Since this is a small model with just a few pieces, I start by clipping everything off the sprue and removing the mold lines. I do decide to paint the head separately for this tutorial, but that's just so I can paint behind it. If this is for an army and you're not as worried about getting every little detail and being a tryhard like I am, you don't need to. Also, I'm sorry if I'm freaking anybody out by cutting towards myself with the blade like this, but this X-Acto knife is duller than a butter knife. Please be careful with your own tools, don't use a sharp blade. I'm also using a sanding stick here on the smoother parts so I don't create additional lines. I'm assembling my model using Tamiya Extra Thin. That gray bottle is the remnants of my last bottle of Tamiya filled with some sprue bits to create a kind of gap-filling paste. There are some gaps when you put this guy together between his legs and his belly, so I used this to smooth those areas out and give it a more natural look. I don't think those gaps are really showing up on screen for you guys, but I'm going to show you how I use this paste I made. It's pretty much the same as regular Tamiya, just don't glob it on there or you will obscure detail, but just work it into wherever you have a mold line that you need filled. Around the belly there is really obvious, so I do go over the line a little bit and just smooth it in. Nurgle models are obviously really forgiving for this technique because if you create extra texture, it's a great gross detail for them. Here I am using my pin vise to drill a hole in the bottom of the head so I can mount it on a cork and paint it. About here is where I'm really regretting having my nails this long because it's really hard to hold these small pieces. That's why we're mounting them on corks. I used this piece of a paper clip and super glue thick to glue it to a cork, and I hold it until it's dry in the angle that it would lay on the model. I then used some blue poster tack to stick down the body and his nurgling, which I actually don't end up painting, to this spare block of wood so I can prime it with Citadel Corax White. I let the primer dry for about an hour. Okie dokie, on to my favorite part, painting the skin. I'm going to show you my favorite way of painting green skin tones. It's actually really similar to how I'd paint human skin. We're going to introduce a lot of pinks and blues to give it some interesting transitions. This isn't the quickest way of painting skin, but it is still relatively fast. And all from start to finish, this model took me about 3 hours, which is very fast for a character model. So even if you're trying to crank out an army, I think you should be able to handle this. I'm going to be using Elysian Green for the bulk of my skin tone and working in Bugman's Glow, which is a brownish rosy pink. I picked out this yellow and pale blue, but I don't actually end up using them. I do, however, use the crap out of this Secret Weapon Tire Black, which is a dark bluish black. And of course my all-time favorite paint, Game Color Warlord Purple, which is a bright magenta. I'm sure you guys already know how to base coat, but I'm going to show you some clips anyway because I filmed them. I typically work with my paints pretty thin, and this base coat's no exception. It takes me about 3 coats for solid coverage in most areas. I'm not worried about painting over any other details that shouldn't be green because they're just going to get repainted later, so just slap it on there. It's Nurgle, who cares? I should have started with a bigger brush for this, but I didn't, and I just grabbed what was closest to me, which ended up being a size 1, and this took forever. But I am too stubborn to admit defeat, so I continued on. I also base coated this head on a stick green, but I didn't keep it that color, so just ignore that for now. Alright, you've seen enough base coating. So we're going to start working on blocking in the shadows. I'm mixing in the Tire Black to my Elysian Green and making a mid-tone color, which I thin down to nearly a glaze consistency. I then start working this color into areas that would be a natural shadow, such as under his neck, arms, legs, anywhere there's a fold or a cut. There's a lot of these. And I'm also working very roughly. I'm not being precise at all. That's part of the beauty of having this color so thin that you don't need to care where you put it. I'm even working it over some of the areas that I'm going to highlight later, and that's just to kind of create a second transitionary color in there. It's just a little bit of blue, so it's interesting for the eye, but not blue. I'm adding more shadows to his back in general because I'm picturing my light coming kind of from the front down at a 45-degree angle, so his back would be much darker. I keep going over the model in stages as well and glazing in more and more blue to the areas I want to be the darkest. So underneath the model and under his feet where there would be the most shadow, I start glazing in near almost pure blue, just so it stays very dark. If you add too much shadow to one area like I did here on his butt, just add more green in. It's easy to go back and forth. Since I'm fighting with my blue tack a little bit, I end up just super gluing it to the cork instead, and it works out a little bit better. I'm also shading that stick head here, but like I said, I don't keep it that color, so don't worry about it. Okay, on his actual face, I'm going to show you how I start working in the purples using that magenta. We're going to build in the same shadows we were using here with the thinned down tire black and green mix. And then we're going to mix in some magenta to the end of that blue there and start working up some rosy blush tones. I'm also making sure to paint underneath where it's going to be attached to the model because in case there's a gap, I don't want that area to have any white showing through. The Warlord Purple doesn't have a ton of coverage to it, but it has a lot of pigment, so a little bit goes a long way. I've mixed a tiny bit in with my tire black and thinned it down to almost water. I'm glazing this over his cheeks, around his mouth, and around his eye. I know it's not showing up very well on camera, so sorry about that. Here's the body once it's dry, so you can get an idea of how I place my shadows. I tried to create smooth, natural-looking transitions, so the only areas that are more blue than green are underneath the model. I'm going to start mixing in that Bugman's Glow to my Elysian Green now and start working on some rosy blush to his limbs. It's close to a 50-50 mix, but I'm working with a very thin glaze still. I start hitting the areas like the top of his knees, his belly, his hands, and his chest there. And I can build this up to be darker, but I want to start light so it doesn't turn into a brown, which happens when you mix any red tones with green. Most Nurgle models have really nice booties, so I like to draw attention to them, and I make this a little bit more pink than other areas. I also work in a little bit of this pink around his shoulders, elbows, the tendons on the back of his hands, etc. I start really light, like I said. I can always go back and add more, like I'm doing here with the back of his calf and his feet and that glorious booty. I keep slowly adding more Bugman's Glow to my mix and going over the areas that I want to be pink. So his belly, booty, hands and feet, knees and elbows, around his chest and on his cheeks. You can always go back and forth and add more green if you feel like it goes too dark. I'm only working up to pure Bugman's Glow in a couple of areas, such as the very tips of his knees and elbows, the harsh lines on his fingers, and on his butt. Also, I do this later off camera, but for any of those bigger wounds and his intestines and the fleshy bagpipe, go ahead and give those a base coat of pure Bugman's Glow. You can probably tell I really like adding in these pink tones. I think for green skin, it just worked really well. So I'm adding in some magenta to that Bugman's Glow mix just to give the pinkest areas a little bit of extra pop. I roughly base coat in this boiled too, but we're going to repaint that later. This is mostly just so I can get the insides of the skin around it, so don't focus too much on making that a solid base coat. I'm quickly glazing over the spine as well. Any areas that would have abrasions or the skin is distressed, I'm going to start working in some bruise effects. Alright, now we're going to start turning some of those pink areas into bruises, like around the wounds. So I'm mixing in some tire black, just getting another little bit of a base coat on that boil to test my color, adding in more blue, and making it more of a bright purple. And I start working that into my shadows to give it a nice transition. This purple is still glaze thin, so even though I'm working it over the majority of my shadows, I'm not turning them purple. I'm just adding a little bit of visual interest. Slap this purple wherever he's got a wound or some boils and it'll start turning into a realistic bruise. I keep working it into the deepest shadows though, that'll give it a nice bounce lighting effect. You can see here that there's barely any color coming off my brush, and this is what you want. Like I said, you can always go back and add more. I wasn't satisfied with what I did with his face with the magenta earlier, so I'm going over it again with the Bugman's Glow and keeping it to his chin and cheeks. I also slap in a quick base coat of Bugman's Glow inside his mouth. A lot of this is going to get covered with a highlight later, so I'm not worried too much about where I place anything, but I am going to start working in that dark purple to where the hood meets his face and underneath his chin. The paint on his body is dry now, so let me give you that good old razzle dazzle. I'm going to start working on blocking in my highlights now by mixing in Flayed One Flesh with my Elysian Green. I'm still thinning this down, but it's not as much of a glaze as my purple was earlier. It's still got a lot of body to it. I'm going to focus this color towards my light source, so on top of his knees and shoulders and anywhere that's getting hit by light, I'm stippling it in instead of layering, so just creating extra texture. I'm adding in more ivory to areas I feel like I need this, but I want to keep the highlights pretty subtle. I am going to highlight the tendons in his feet and on his hands, but I want to keep as much of the pink showing as possible. I'm going to later be using this Flayed One Flesh to base coat in the bones and the ivory and that strap going across his body, so it'll all tie into the skin color scheme. I'm focusing in my brightest highlights onto his chest, shoulders, and his raised arm. For any areas that I want to really pop in that highlight, I dot a tiny amount of pure Flayed One Flesh in along the edge, but like I said, keep this very subtle. On his face, I'm going to highlight his chin, upper lip, and cheekbones, but I want to keep as much of the pink showing below that as possible. I've also added some of the Flayed One Flesh into his eye, but I re-base coat over this later with Bugman's Glow. I also paint the teeth ivory while I'm working on this, but it'll take a couple of coats to get that pure ivory. Since the face is what you want to draw attention to, I keep building up these highlights a little bit brighter than I had on the rest of the body and add some more stippled in pure ivory. Body's dry now. Once again, time for the old razzle dazzle. You can see that the face is a little bit brighter overall than the body was, but once again, sorry for the video quality being overall pretty dark. Okay, intestine time. I'm going to start with some more Bugman's Glow, some Evil Sunz Scarlet, more of that tire black, and a white. For this one, I'm using Pro Acryl from Monument. I'm also going to use more of that Warlord Purple Magenta, but not as much as on the rest of the body. I want to keep it differentiated. So I'm mixing in some base coats with my Evil Sunz Scarlet and the Bugman's Glow again, probably about 50-50. Not thinning this down as much. It is definitely base coat consistency. And I'm just going to start stippling in a couple of scratches here and there on top of the intestines. There's not actually a lot of built-in texture to this, so I'm trying to simulate some of my own. Underneath, I'm gonna flip the model upside down and add more red into that mix to imply there's more blood at the bottom. Next, I'm gonna create another glaze out of my tire black and work that into the recesses and all the shadows. Next, I'm going to start highlighting by mixing in some white to my Bugman's Glow, about 50-50 or less. I don't want it to come off too bright. And I'm just going to stipple that on the tops of each of the intestines, just little dots. Once that's dry, I'm going to add in a little bit more white to that same mix and imply that these are juicy organs by brightening them up. Next, I'm going to glaze in some pure Evil Sunz Scarlet. You can see it's watered down. There's pretty much no color there at all. I do add a little bit more paint than that. And I'm going to glaze it over the organs just to tie in all the colors together. Next, I mix in the scarlet with the tire black to create sort of a muddy blood color and just dot that into some spots like where the intestines cut and in some of the recesses. And with that, the intestines are done. Okay, we're gonna work on this bagpipe. I base coated it off camera using Bugman's Glow, and now that I've gotten all my artistry out working on the skin, I'm just gonna wash it with Reikland Flesh Shade. I don't care if this pools too much in any of the recesses. Obviously, I'm gonna avoid big drips, but I don't want to get any on the skin. Queen of using a brush that's too small for the job. After that's dry, I'm going to apply Caribou Crimson towards the bottom 70%. I want to keep the Reikland Flesh Shade just at the top where the highlight would be, but everything else is going to get wash red, again keeping this off the skin. The back of it's all going to get washed this red. I don't care if there's highlight on it or not, and I'm too lazy to look up the 360 view to see how Heavy Metal painted it. Okay, next we're going to start using that Evil Sunz Scarlet mix again that we made with Bugman's Glow and start trying to replicate the box art and block in this red towards the bottom. Admittedly, I kind of struggled with painting this bagpipe. I didn't spend very much time on it, but I also didn't want to, so it's just okay in the end, but it'll pass. I'm adding more of this crimson on the back than I did in the front, but I'm still keeping the wash showing in the recesses. I'm working it up towards pure Evil Sunz Scarlet, but I'm trying to keep it focused towards the bottom of the bagpipe. Next, we're going to use more of that tire black to block in some more shadows, mixing this in with the scarlet and just going over where I covered up too much of the washed areas and back towards the body. But again, don't get it on the skin or you'll be in trouble. I'm going to start glazing in Bugman's Glow again towards the top where the highlight's supposed to be. We're going to highlight all the bulging raised areas in the veins with this Bugman's Glow, but keep more of the red showing towards the bottom. The back I'm keeping darker, so I don't go over it quite as much as the front. I want to make sure I have a good base coat to start highlighting at the top, so I go over it a second time with the Bugman's Glow to make sure it's saturated. Next, I'm going to start adding in the white to the Bugman's Glow and start slowly building up these highlights. It's a little difficult and I go too bright in some areas, so I'm fighting with the paint and working back and forth with Bugman's Glow as needed to darken it down again. I'm starting to get lazy and just stippling in the highlights, but it works since it's supposed to be a gross organ thing. I keep adding in more white to build these up towards the top. This also helps create the illusion that it might be a little bit wet. I reintroduce shadows as needed with that mix of the blue and the red. I'm not happy with the transition, so I'm going to go back in with a little bit of the Reikland Flesh shade and use it as a glaze to tie those colors together. Good enough for me, calling it done. Next, I'm going to start working on the bagpipes, the bones, the straps, and the wood on the model. So I'm going to use flayed one flesh for the lighter parts, and for the bagpipes that are black, I'm going to start with storm vermin fur. I'm going to work with this thinned down gray and base coat, but I actually want the white to show through a little bit. Not just so I can be lazy on the highlights, but because the box art shows that they have a little bit of transition, and I don't want to work that hard for it. Once I've got those covered, I go in and I base coat the nails and the toes with this color, but it's not dark enough, so I grab a black and go over them again. I'm using Vallejo Model Air Black. It was just the closest to me. You can use whatever black you have. I'm not worried about making this color solid. If the gray shows through, free highlight. I do a second coat of this gray towards the top of the bagpipes only, just to start building in that darker transition. Next, I'm going to go in with the ivory and base coat the other bagpipes, the strap across the model, all the bone, and the wood on the staff. The straps holding the bagpipes together are different colors on the box art. I'm going to do this one the same way as I'm doing the rest of the bone. The back one I'm going to paint the same way as the hat. This ivory doesn't have great coverage, so just do layers until you have a solid base coat. Okay, next we're going to use some washes to get some quick shadows and transitions and make these look like they're different materials. I'm going to be using Seraphim Sepia, Nuln Oil, and Agrex Earthshade for the most part. I accidentally forgot to start filming, but I gave these a wash of Seraphim Sepia and then a wash of Agrex Earthshade, and now I'm going in with a second coat of Agrex Earthshade towards the tops and some select areas to darken them down. I'm hitting the skull with a second coat of the Agrex Earthshade, but the horn next to it actually got a coat of Nuln Oil off camera. I also worked some Nuln Oil into the eye of the skull to make it darker. Now I'm breaking out the Nuln Oil again and washing the horn down one more time to make sure it looks different from the skull that's next to it. I'm also going to wash the ends of the bagpipes to make that transition. I also hit the fingers and toes, because why not? You can see by the rainbow on my glove that I'm using the magic of film to jump around and paint different areas while other things are drying. Don't worry, it'll come in a little bit. For the bagpipes, I'm using some black paint to darken down the openings where the wash didn't quite get. Working in some quick highlights with storm vermin fur. And and then quickly adding in some white for another highlight just towards the very tops. Also highlighting the nails and toes. I'm not that lazy. Now I'm going to go back in and highlight with the ivory, but I want to keep these looking like different materials. I do that by using less ivory in some areas. For example, the staff that's going to be wood is going to keep more of the brown, and I'm just going to hit a few of the edges. But these bagpipes and the straps are supposed to be pretty light, so they're getting a good coat. Now I'm going to start on his hat. I'm going to use Rhinox hide to get that reddish brown base coat. I start with an appropriately sized brush for once to block in the majority of the color, but then I switch to a smaller one so I can cut in the details without getting any paint on the face or the tongue. To start highlighting, I make a glaze out of this Doom Bowl brown. It's a pretty orangey red, and I don't want to cover right away, so I'm going in thin and just blocking in the color where I want to start my transitions. It looks pretty stark at first, but it does blend in as it dries. So I just start building up coats towards the top and blending towards the creases. I keep building up this brown until the creases are nearly completely orange. Once I'm happy with the level of orange, I'm going to start using Ungor flesh to build up to the brightest highlights. My pot of paint here has gone a little bit bad, so it's pretty thin, but it's okay, I'm still going to use it. It's just going to be an edge highlight, so I don't need very much. I keep building it up towards the highest points. I want the creases to be the brightest, but I want it to fade into the rest of the cloth. At the sharpest points, I want to dot in some pure Ungor flesh. I'm keeping all these highlights fairly rough, just to give the impression that there's some texture to this cloth. It's Nurgle. I'm going back in with some of the previous orange and glazing over my highlights a little bit. Wasn't quite happy with the transition, so this will help blend them back in. Once we're done there, we're going to work on the tongue. I'm going to start with Sotek green, which is kind of a turquoise, And then I'm also going to use some of that Game Color Warlord Purple Magenta to turn it into a purple towards the tip. This is why I was avoiding getting any brown on the tongue earlier. I'm working with this blue thinned down so that I can leave a little bit of the highlight underneath from the white, and then I don't have to work quite as hard to brighten it back up later. Once that's base coated, I'm going to wash it with Drakenhof Nightshade and Druchii Violet. I'm using the blue towards the mouth and then wet blending the purple wash towards the tip of the tongue. The purple doesn't end up quite as solid as I want it, so once those are dry, I go in with another coat of purple over the whole tongue. Once that's dry, I mix in some magenta with the blue and create a nice bright purple, and then I layer that on the tip. I'm avoiding covering over the shade in the recess of the tongue. I'm mixing in just a little bit more magenta and hitting the very tip of the tongue only to give it that rainbow looking transition. Next, I'm using the base coat color to highlight towards the mouth. I'm going to be mixing in some white with this to give it kind of a wet effect. I'm just stippling this highlight in, I'm not layering it. That'll make it look like the tongue has texture and that it's moist. Once again, avoid hitting the shaded area towards the middle of the tongue. You want to keep that line dark. Just keep adding white a little bit at a time until you're happy with the shine. All done. Next, we're going to work on some fun parts again, the pus-filled boils. I'm going to use XV88 for a base coat. It's a nice yellow-brown. I'm just going to hit every individual pimple and also the big one on the belly. I'm going to give this a base coat, but avoid hitting the pink around the skin. Nurgle models have a lot of these little pimples, and it's kind of inevitable that you're going to miss them on your first pass, but just do your best to hit them all. You don't have to be very careful in base coating them, just hit the majority of the pimple, the rest is going to be implied later with some washes. Once those are dried, we're going to hit them with a wash of Seraphim Sepia. We want the wash to cover each pimple and hit the surrounding skin a little bit. If they're in a bigger cluster, you can run over a little bit more. Don't let this pool on the skin so it drips, just coat around it. I'm also washing the spine again with this color. I wanted it to be a little bit more yellow. If you do find out you missed some pimples like I did on the shoulder, just hit them with the wash. You don't really need to base coat them again unless they're big. Once that's dry, I'm going to go back in with XV88 and hit the tops of the biggest pimples really quickly to start highlighting them. Don't worry about being too clean. Next, I'm going to go in and make these look like they're really sore by giving them a light wash with Caribou Crimson. You especially want to hit any of these popped pimples, the ones that have a hole in them, and just dribble the wash down a little bit into the skin, but don't let it pool anywhere at all. We're just using this as if it were a glaze. I'm also washing inside of these bigger sores and around the spine to make it look like it's hurting and bruised. Then I'm going to go back in with XV88 one more time and brighten up the biggest boils. I'm going to start highlighting these by slowly mixing in Flayed One Flesh or another ivory a little bit at a time. You want to build this up pretty slowly so you get a smooth transition. This biggest foil you want to highlight similar to how you would a gem, so keep your brightest points towards the bottom and it's darker towards the top. Keep highlighting these until you've worked up to nearly a pure ivory. That'll make them look really gross. For the biggest foil, I'm also mixing in a little bit of white here just to give it that extra oomph. Next up, I'm going to work on the metallics. There's not a lot of these, so I'm going to work on them really quickly. I'm using Belshazzar Gold for the gold copper parts and Lead Belcher for the silver. I don't really thin these down at all, so I can get away with kind of one coat, but if you need to, go ahead. I needed 2 coats here on the round balls, and I missed a bell hanging off the wrist. Next up, I painted the silver parts with Lead Belcher. I'm going to wash the metal parts with Agrax Earthshade Gloss, but if you're going to seal the model, just use regular Agrax Earthshade for now. You can always add the gloss back in after you seal it. Try to avoid getting this on the skin or the surrounding areas, or else it's going to be shiny where you don't want it to be. Once that's dry, we're almost done. All that's left to do is finish the head on the stick. I'm going to repaint the skin with Flayed One Flesh, but it's going to take a couple coats to cover because I have that green base coat down. While that's drying, I'm going to use just any old black and start base coating that hood. I don't want to get any black on the skin or the metal that's already done, so I'm using a pretty small brush. Once that's done, I do another layer of ivory on the skin. Next, I'm going to quickly paint that bag that's hanging down below the face with a mix of my blue and magenta, just make a quick purple. While that dries, I'm going to slap some ivory on these ropes. A little bit more on the face. Quick highlight to the bag by mixing in some more blue. And while I've got it on the brush, just gonna slap this around inside the mouth a little bit. Slap too hard on the edge, so I'm gonna clean it up with a little bit of ivory. Then one more coat on the ropes. And we're going to use some washes on the skin to get a quick ghostly effect. I'm going to start with Nailac Oxide, which is not intended for this purpose, but I like the color, so I'm using it. I'm just doing a quick wash all over, but I'm not really letting it pool very much. While that dries, I'm doing another highlight on the bag by just mixing in some ivory to that previous purple. Still drying, so I'm going to use the Nailac Oxide for its intended purpose and splotch it randomly into some of the copper areas. Once the wash on the face is dry enough, I'm going to use a wash of Coelia green shade to darken the recesses. Make sure to let it pool a tiny bit inside the mouth, around the eye, and underneath the cheekbones to bring out these details. Now while we wait for that to dry, I'm going to do a quick highlight on the copper using Sycorax bronze. I'm just going to stipple this into a couple of the highest points to give it a little bit more shine. I forgot to hit the back earlier with any Nailac Oxide, so I'm just adding some now. When the face is dry, I'm going to mix Nailac Oxide and my Flayed One Flesh to highlight the raised details. I give the eye a couple more coats than the rest of the face just to make it look like it's glowing a little bit. Keeping busy while that dries, I'm going to give the ropes a quick wash with Agrax Earthshade, and that's really all I'm going to do to them. Since I'm already here, I'm going to wash the bag as well. I'm going to do a really quick highlight on the hood using Storm Vermin Fur. I'm working thin and just scratching in some areas, but I'm not really putting effort into doing edge highlighting here. Just trying to do some scratches and make it look like it's an old cloth texture. And then just some scratchy highlights on the highest points using the same Storm Vermin Fur, just not quite as thinned down as before. Here I'm just hitting the last couple edges to frame the face. I'm going to make one more highlight step a little bit brighter than before and just go over the face one more time. Make sure to hit that eye with ivory again to make it really stand out. And then I'm going to use a little bit of magenta on the tip of the tongue in the bag to make them look a little bit more interesting. Next I'm going to paint his eye. I'm using a mix of Flayed One Flesh and Bugman's Glow to give it a fleshy, sore looking base coat. Next I'm going to use Thin Tire Black to paint the pupil. Just going to make him look over his shoulder a little bit, not centered. Then a quick dot of ivory for the highlight and his eye's done. Lastly, I'm going to use some Blood for the Blood God and Nurgle's Rot to finish off those gross Nurgle effects. I used the blood to finish the dripping bagpipe and a couple spots inside his intestines. I'm also going to paint some streaks running down from any of the gross popped pimples, as well as work this into the center boil and any of the other sores around his body. Make sure to also hit any of the hanging skin flaps from the sores. Why the heck not? Throw some more on the bagpipe. All I'm going to do with the Nurgle's Rot is this little drip coming out of the bagpipe, and then while it's on my brush, just a couple spots inside the intestines and the sores. I'm also going to put some in the mouth on the ghostly head. My green is not very strong, so you can build this up over a couple coats if you need to. But that's really it. He's done. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you had fun, and I hope you learned some techniques to help you paint your own Nurgle models. I sure had fun painting him. Maybe in the next video we'll make a base for him. We'll see. If you guys enjoyed the video, please make sure to like and subscribe to my channel, and maybe leave me a comment below on what I should paint next time. To compensate for the potato quality of the video, I'll leave you some still shots so you can actually tell what color things are. That's all for now. Bye!